Hello? Okay, great, the mic is live. Good morning, everyone. My name is Melba Pearson, and I am the co-chair of the Prosecution Function Committee, as well as the immediate past president of the National Black Prosecutors Association. It is my honor to do this panel with regards to creating the Conscious Prosecutor, the Client Pre-Indictment. I know all of you have seen and bore witness to the turmoil that our criminal justice system is currently in. When you look at incidences in Baltimore, you look at Milwaukee, you look at Chicago, all across the country, there are questions with regards to prosecutors taking action or not taking action, and what exactly is the role of the prosecutor in bringing, I guess, an end to the turmoil that we're seeing and making sure that there is fairness in the criminal justice system. So I have a very esteemed panel to discuss some of these tough issues regarding implicit bias and how we work with communities of color. I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves, but I will say we have San Francisco District Attorney George Gascón, we have Professor David Harris from the University of Pittsburgh, and we have our very own Wayne McKenzie, who is General Counsel to the New York City Department of Probation, as well as just an amazing person here in the ABA who's been doing a lot of work in the field of implicit bias and racial justice. So starting closest to me, Mr. Gascón, if you can introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure being here today. You know, as I'm sure we all have seen in the last couple of years, starting with Ferguson, we have some significant problems in the criminal justice system, and while they are not really new, these problems have been there probably going back to the days of slavery, if we really wanted to be honest about tracking the history of race and certainly the African-American experience and the judicial system in this country. I think Ferguson was a watershed moment for our generation in bringing things to light once again. And what we have seen ever since, you know, with the officer-involved shootings, the problems that have occurred here in San Francisco, for instance, about a year and a half ago, we began with what we call here now TextGate, which was a series of text messages involving 14 San Francisco police officers were extremely racist in nature. And initially, well, not initially, to this day, still many in the police department call it an aberration and not necessarily symbolic of what else is going on with the police department. But within a year, having a second wave of text messages, but yet another group of officers, again, very racist in nature, and then looking at the data, the impact that the criminal justice system is having in African Americans here in San Francisco, which is very consistent with what is going on in the rest of the nation, and how that impacts the work of a prosecutor, I think is really important, because not only are we talking about implicit bias, which is certainly a major problem, but we're even talking about very explicit bias in the system, certainly as evidenced by the text messaging and the conversations that were going on between these officers. And the role of prosecutors, as I'd like to call them, you know, we're the guardians of the Constitution, right? We're the gatekeepers when it comes to how people are going to enter the judicial system within the criminal justice system. And what has been traditionally our role, which often is one that we blindly follow what the story, the narrative that is given to us by the police, and, you know, and unfortunately in some cases even enhancing that narrative and seeing where that has taken us, and how do we, become more honest with ourselves and realize that we are as much part of the problem and we're going to have to be part of the solution. You know, I don't want to get into the whole concept of mass incarceration and all that, because we can go on that piece forever as well. But the bottom line is that we as prosecutors play a major role in what is going on in the criminal justice system, and we cannot become part of the solution until we admit, number one, that we play a major role, and secondly, that we take the necessary steps in order to ensure that the work that we're doing is is having a different impact. And one of the things that we have to move away from this concept of color blindness, because the reality is that that is not a real term. We like to think that we prosecute cases and we look at cases and we're totally colorblind, but when you look at the evidence or the impact of our work, it's clearly having a very disparate impact, certainly in the African American community, but in the Latino community and other poor communities as well. And until we face the fact that it's not colorblind, that there are real consequences that do have race implications in our work, we're going to have a problem fixing the problem. I'm going to leave it at that, and we can go on to our discussion.
Okay, Professor Harris.
Good morning, everyone. I'm David Harris. I am the John Murray Faculty Scholar and Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, where I teach criminal law, criminal procedure evidence, and also a seminar based on the TV show The Wire. I am also the host of the Criminal Injustice podcast, which you can find on iTunes and many other places. I'm very grateful to be with you today and to have the chance to talk a little bit about implicit bias and how I think it comes into the picture when we talk about prosecution and the justice system as a whole. I think we have to start out by making a few remarks or qualifications about bias, about implicit bias, because I think a lot of people still believe that racial bias still manifests itself in the old kind of Archie Bunker archetype. The person who says racially biased things out loud, uses stereotypes about women, blacks, Jews, Latinos, whoever, that kind of thing is what how racial bias really expresses itself. And I think while that still certainly exists, I think we know that now if we didn't know it a year ago, it is not where the justice system needs to focus right now, because the far greater problem is one that we have not been aware of until fairly recently. Science has only really focused in on this in the past 10 to 20 years with good evidence, and now the justice system is trying to focus in on it, and that is implicit bias. It's unconscious bias that manifests itself in the minds of almost everyone. Now, that's a very critical thing I said right at the end. Almost everyone. This is not a police thing. This is not a prosecutor thing. This is a human being thing, and it's very important to remember that. Implicit bias, implicit meaning thoughts, feelings, patterns of thought of which we are unaware. Bias meaning a preference or an aversion for a certain person or group of people, identified usually by, not exclusively by, but often by visual characteristics. Now, let's start also by denoting what this isn't. It's not about your character. It's not about whether you're a good person or not. It's not even about whether you have conscious egalitarian beliefs. It's about the psychological roots of human behavior. Note that word again, human. It's a human being problem. It's not about what you think about your behavior either. It is a concept in which situations matter much more than your beliefs, because it turns out that situations, social situations, whether on the macro level or on your own personal interactive level, those are the things that allow implicit bias to kind of operate even when you don't know it. Implicit bias is present. It is the concept that we need to think of when we make quick judgments about persons or groups unconsciously, often resulting in discrimination, whether it's intended or not. Okay? Let me repeat that. Quick judgments about people or groups, unconsciously made, often resulting in discriminatory behavior, whether intended or not. What's going on here? Well, these are really shortcuts that operate in the mind. How many have ever read the really excellent book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow? Okay, really good book. I highly, highly recommend it. The guy can really write, too, as a bonus. What we're talking about is the fast thinking system is what he calls it, something like that. But shortcuts in the mind for when information is very scarce and when you have to act fast. I mean, you can see the evolutionary benefits for this if you're back living on the savannah and you're trying to avoid the saber-toothed tiger or the other group down there that you don't belong to that also wants access to the watering hole. Great, but today it's not such a good fit. I mean, what happens is we cue onto visible identity and situations, and when we combine those two things, the social situation and visible identity, we can make big mistakes in the world we live in today. I mean, walk to the Moscone Center from anywhere 15 minutes away, and you'll see countless people, almost all of whom you know nothing about, and so many differences. And you're making judgments about the people you see in the groups you see all the time. And if you act on those without really having any awareness, your biases can click in. May have worked great back in the very distant past to keep us alive, but today that can look a lot like discrimination. And it may be unintended discrimination, but that doesn't matter to the person on the other end of it. To say that you didn't intend it, it has the same impact on them. We know a lot of this now as a matter of very solid science from something called the IAT, the Implicit Association Test. How many have taken it, know a little bit about it? Okay, I do recommend it, but we'll talk more about that later, I assume, in Q&A. The important thing to remember is that prosecutors, sitting as they do at a crucial point in the justice system, if they are not aware of the existence of these biases, if they don't have any consciousness about them, if they don't know what to do to counteract those biases, those can become part of how any individual prosecutor operates in any individual case, and if we're not careful, they can become part of the systems in those offices. Now, I'll just stop here and look forward to the discussion.
Okay.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Wayne McKenzie, and I guess I'm going to start by saying, speaking of implicit bias, why am I the one at the separate table? You know, I feel like I'm at the little kids' table on Thanksgiving. Second thing is, I think David sort of stole a lot of what I was going to have to say. So obviously that means he's not only accurate, but I'll start by saying or correcting one thing. David stressed that almost everyone. I'm going to emphasize that each and every human being, we all have implicit prejudices and preferences. Okay, so that's got to be the start. Each and every one of us are equally yoked in that manner. I guess I should say, not only am I a past president of the National Black Prosecutors, but since the president of the Metropolitan Black Bar Association is in the room, I should add I'm also a board member of the Black Bar in New York City. I actually started off my career as a prosecutor in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, the Kings County DA's office. And while I was an active prosecutor for 15 years, I've been a black man all my life. And so my experiences growing up in Brooklyn versus my experiences in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, I often suffered what you will call cultural collisions. And quite often, I saw things where I came from a very progressive office. I had great colleagues, but there were often times where interacting with my colleagues, I noticed inequities, and I also noticed interactions with various police officers. And so there came a time where I was contacted by the Vera Institute of Justice because they were starting this program. Well, they had a concept paper. It was just a mere concept paper at the time. And it was about, is it possible to use data to identify unwarranted decision-making in prosecutor offices And could you then develop a way to respond to that? It turned out I ended up being the founding director of the Prosecution and Racial Justice Program at the Vera Institute. And I'm also proud to say that one of my star advisory board members at the time was Professor Harris. And so my experiences at Vera is what really got me into this field of implicit bias, and doing a lot of work in that area and realizing that implicit bias was a bigger problem and a greater challenge than even overt racism. Because it's true that every racist has implicit biases, right? But just because you have implicit biases does not make you a racist. And my work at Vera actually identified areas of implicit bias. And it also identified real things that we can actually do as prosecutors to address it. One of the things that came out of that is the criminal justice section developed, it was called the Building Community Trust Project. And we actually created, over the course of about maybe 1.5 years to 2 years, a cultural competency curriculum. And so I guess I'll stop by saying that while each and every one of us have these biases, they're malleable. So the potential for addressing this is there, it's real, and I hope that's one of the key things that comes out of this panel.
Thank you, Wayne. So I'm just going to throw this question out to the panel. How exactly does implicit bias manifest itself in the field of prosecution, and what dangers result from that?
I am the only person here who has not spent a substantial amount of time as a prosecutor, so I shouldn't go first, but here I am. It can manifest itself in any number of ways, but basically what you're talking about, not just in prosecution, but in even being a defense lawyer, are discretionary decision points. If you can identify the discretionary decision points that a prosecutor or prosecutor's office has to focus on, you've hit the places where implicit bias could play a role. So it's everything from whether or not you toss a case out as soon as it comes in, what they used to call in DC no papering. It's about what plea bargains get offered, who gets the diversion opportunity, what the plea deal is, what the sentencing recommendation is, all of those things, what the charges are, all those decision points along the way are where that can manifest.
Yeah, I agree with David, and I would take it one step further. I think it goes beyond the prosecution. I think it impacts the defenders. I think it impacts the bench. I think it impacts probation. Collectively, because as Wayne indicated, we all have this, as part of being a human. It can really impact the way that everybody negotiates these deals. I can tell you that even within the public defender's office, sometimes how they view perhaps a client, an African-American client, and a client from other group might be different, and they may be more willing to accept a higher consequences for a similar behavior, and we're seeing that. We're actually taking a look at this stuff. So it's the entire system, and that's why it's so important for the entire system to be aware of it.
And so absolutely, implicit bias definitely predicts and has real-world behavior. I remember before I even agreed to join Vera, I went around meeting the various prosecutors who were going to be involved in the project, at least the foundation of the project. And I went to Milwaukee, and the district attorney at that time was E. Michael McCann. And he'd been DA for, I think it was about maybe 32 years. And so Mike McCann said to me that Wisconsin had the highest disparate rate of the incarceration of black men in the United States. And he said the highest African-American population in Wisconsin was in the city of Milwaukee. And he said, so basically, Milwaukee is clearly driving that train, and that he's pretty sure that he's hired the most conscious, the most fair individuals that he could find. But clearly something else is going on. And if I couldn't help them figure it out, he would take that as evidence of my own incompetence. I laughed, and I guess still decided to take the job. But here's a real-life example. One of the jurisdictions that I worked in, the group that was most negatively being impacted in the prosecution of drug charges were surprisingly African-American women. Even though that jurisdiction had about a 33 to 34% declination rate when cases were brought into the office for review, every case involving a black woman was accepted for prosecution. 98% of the time, whatever the arrest charges were the charges that were being prosecuted. Their cases went through the system and stayed in the system a longer period of time, and their sentences comparatively were more harsh than other folks that were being charged with similar crimes. And so we've done an analysis. We came back to the office. We were speaking with the managers, and we asked the question, what do you think is going on here? And the response was, well, while you're just looking at drug charges, we're sure that there are prostitution charges, and there's a prostitution history associated with these particular class of defendants. And that impacts what the offer is and how they're treated. And so I said, well, we've already thought about that, and so here's the cohort of cases of white women with the same type of narcotics charges, and also with a history of prostitution. So there's got to be something else going on. Now, while we were talking about implicit bias, but here's how sometimes I think overt racism or insensitivity can creep into the process. One of the managers actually said, before we showed them the data involving the white women, that, yeah, most of those folks, they're just crack hoes. And so my question was, after there was a chill in the room and everyone looked at me, I talked about the other data, and I said, so now let's discuss why you're treating your black crack hoes different from your white crack hoes. And while the conversation never got around to the terms of implicit bias, when we went back and looked at the data for the next 6 to 12 months, that disparity had completely disappeared. All of a sudden, the cases of African American women were being rejected for prosecution at exactly the same rate as everyone else in the office. So clearly, there was something going on there.
Wow. So dovetailing on what you were talking about, Wayne, about this specific example, what does the data say with regards to implicit bias in prosecution or the criminal justice system at large, just so we can kind of get an idea of how big the problem is and then work on how to fix it?
Right. So I like giving real-world examples. And I'll go back to an experience that we had in Milwaukee, where we looked at their declination rates to prosecute cases. And across the office, when you looked at white and black defendants, their refusal to accept their refusal to charge cases was exactly the same. It was just around 33 to 34%. We then divided that down into looking at felonies and misdemeanors. And felonies, they were exactly the same. Misdemeanors, it's about maybe a 1% difference. And their general belief was, clearly, we're doing a great job here. But what we also did was we separated the cases out into the 9 key crime categories that the office prosecuted. And in 6 of those 9 categories, if you were black, you actually stood a better chance of having your case not prosecuted. It was small, but you stood a better chance. In one of the categories, the numbers were so small, it really has no scientific significance. But there were 2 categories where if you were black, you stood a significantly better chance of being prosecuted than if you were white. It's just that when you looked at everything, it was masked. Can anyone take a guess at what those 2 crime categories were? Narcotics and public order offenses. 2 categories where the greatest amount of discretion comes in terms of policing and charging. Real world example. Let me stop there because there's so much more and so much deeper I can go into this, and I want to give everyone else a chance.
Well, Professor Harris and then Mr. Gascón, or either.
Okay. So, there's no question that having good data is really critical to understanding what's going on within the office. And in my experience, what we have, unless you have a group like Vera or what we're doing now in my office, that we're bringing in, we brought in researchers from Cal and from the University of Pennsylvania, and they're looking at the information. It's very, very hard to discern the message that the data is giving you, because most of our offices really have poor, very, very poor data. And it's very hard to drill down to the level of specificity as Wayne is talking about over extended periods of time, unless you have somebody just counting widgets, which generally most of us do not have the resources to do it. It's not like you punch a button in your records management system and this data comes out. As a matter of fact, when I first became DA in 2011, I invited Vera to come in and do the same work that they had done at the time they were just finishing Manhattan, the New York DA. And after about a little over a year of going over, they finally threw their hands up and they said, we just can't do the work in your office unless we had a lot more money, because your data is so corrupt. So it took us really another 2 years to actually get a couple of grants, and then by that time, Vera wasn't doing as much of that work anymore, and we found a couple of other researchers that literally had to start doing statistical sampling to be able to get to a better place. And we're hoping that by the fall of this year, we'll be able to publish, not only publish, but we'll be able to start looking at our own practice and then trying to understand what are the areas that we can correct ourselves. But I have to tell you, coming from an extremely progressive, as I'm sure most of you know, probably one of the most progressive counties in the country. In fact, I often think it's dangerous because we develop what we call San Francisco exceptionalism. We think we're immune to racism, but yet, most of the other data that we look at, it definitely points in a different direction. But the data that the criminal justice system has in general is very, very poor. And we need to, quite frankly, we need the federal government, we need some help to start getting much, much better data so that we can do the kind of analytical work that is being now done on a retail basis by, some offices bringing in a researcher and really having a national conversation around this.
And just a quick follow-up to put out to the group. I mean, is it possible to have a data management system where you can press a button and see if there's disparities? Is that technology out there, or is that something that we need to talk to our senators and our congressmen to help fund?
I don't think it's there today, but is it possible to do it? Is the technology there to do so? Absolutely, yes. We just don't have it.
Yeah, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of what DA Gascón just said and what my friend Wayne McKenzie just said. You have to have data on what you're doing in your office. And I know that doesn't make everybody super comfortable, but if you are not doing that, you cannot possibly answer the question, do we have an implicit or explicit bias problem? You can say all you want, oh, we're good people, we hire the best, we have a policy against that. I got to tell you, that's what I heard for years and years and years from police forces when I started doing work on racial profiling back in the 1990s when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. And the answer then that I would have given them is the same as I would give anybody else now. If you don't have data, you can't possibly say that. What you can say is, that's my feeling for what that may be worth, but folks who maybe have a different feel about your office could just as easily say, no, I think you're racist, or I think you're not taking care of business. The only other thing I would add for data is to understand that the IAT, the Implicit Association Test, which I mentioned before, indicates over millions and millions of anonymous test administrations. 75% of all Americans have a preference, a bias for whites over blacks. This breaks down into almost 90% of all whites, but it also shows somewhere between 40 and 50% of all African Americans hold the same bias, which you may think is somewhat odd, but if you want, we can get into that in Q&A. There are reasons for it. But given those overwhelming numbers, if you're not measuring in your office, you haven't started yet.
Right. So I guess 3 points. Number one is emphasizing about the data, and to say that, first of all, we've got to realize that most DA's offices in this country are pretty small, and any type of data systems they have are fairly antiquated. And even in some of the biggest and best offices, the systems are more like case tracking systems, right? So it'll track a case from acceptance to what happens, what's the final outcome. When you're talking about a data management system, you're talking about something that's far more robust, and you're talking about a process where you've got to be super careful about and the accuracy of what gets entered. When you were talking about DA, about corrupt data. And the sad truth is, not many, if any, DA offices truly have the type of case management system that you need to do this work. And I agree it's worth the investment, because while we're talking about race and implicit bias, the same process that you would use to tease that out can help you manage your office more efficiently in so many other areas. So it's clearly, it's worth the investment. And the last thing I will say is, because I was sort of this bridge between having experience as a manager in a DA's office and the social scientist, right? And I always cautioned everyone that the data should never be the answer. The motivation is it should spur you to figure out what additional questions you need to ask as you tease down. And for me, that's really, really important, because the power of doing this work is, if you have a researcher that comes in and they collect data, they're going to give you a snapshot of your office for the period of time that they were there, right? If prosecutor offices ultimately get the systems that they need and develop the capacity to do this on an ongoing basis, the difference becomes, what I always say is, taking the temperature of the office or having the power to be a thermostat where you're always managing the temperature of your office.